So in my professional context, when we talk about vulnerability, there's like two buckets, I guess, that I look at in the sense of personal vulnerability and professional vulnerability, meaning
Mhm.
that personal vulnerability is like you get out olive Ange, you know, which, which may feel extra at times.
For better or for worse.
But professional vulnerability is you get Ange with a filter. So you
Mm,
may not hear all of Ange's personal thoughts or opinions or feelings. You hear it, but
mhm,
not to the extent of what personal Ange can show up. So for example, in the workplace, I've learned that vulnerability equals admitting to failure, period.
mhm.
In Angie's personal life, vulnerability means admitting to failure, talking about her anxiety, identifying what she's working through, and also the feelings that percolate around the same. Um, that's not always well received, I find, in the workplace, which it goes back to that fine balance of, when do you call out vulnerability, or when do you put some sort of filter on it, not not to take away the piece of authenticity, but
Mhm.
what I've seen in past is that people want you to be honest and they want you to be vulnerable, but there's a stop line.
There is, right? I mean, I'm sure we've all been in a situation where we've had someone been too vulnerable, like to an extent that was
Yes.
kind of like, okay, well, was that all necessary to be said? And I do tend to agree with you, Anja. There is a bit of a line there, and it's interesting when you're talking about the difference between personal and professional vulnerability. Like for me, I don't feel we'll call it fear, or don't feel like any stickiness around saying, hey, I did this thing and I messed up, or like, hey,
Mm,
I did this and I failed at it,
mm,
or admitting to mistakes.
mm,
I don't feel any ickiness around that. If you ask me how I feel about making that mistake, or if you ask me like the actual feelings that come up for me personally and are expecting me to talk about
mm,
those feelings, whoa,
mhm.
wait a second now. Like that for me is a little too much. Uh, no, let's go back to the tactical piece of the mistake I made versus like, well, how does making this mistake make me feel?
Oh, I understand how you're placing that. So for you, it's you can equate it to more of a tactical equation and then problem solve that and identify what you would do differently
Mhm.
because there's no emotions attached to it. It's just, I forgot to send the email. In future, I will make sure I turn on a reminder.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Mm, mm. That's really interesting. Because that does fit the definition of vulnerability. Like when you look at it, it's on its
Mhm.
face, right?
Yeah.
So, being vulnerable is being able to show yourself, which is true. I
Mhm.
forgot to send the email. And it also shows a sign of courage in identifying, what that resolve is, which is
Mhm.
also vulnerability. So, i.e., in this example, in future, I'll set a reminder just to send the email. Um, I think and this is my own personal opinion, I think where vulnerability can come into question is if people sense that there's more, if people
Mm.
sense that we're not being totally genuine with our vulnerability,
Mhm.
then that's when it kind of comes into question. And I love the topic of vulnerability because there's depth and breadth to it. Everybody's different
Mm.
as to their
Yeah.
definitions and how it shows up for them, regardless of what you read in context.
I think to your point there, so the missing piece, let's say if you're feeling there's more, it's not so much like in this example, me talking about how this made me feel, but rather I
Mm.
said one email, but it was actually 10 emails. But I only told you it was one. But no, there's all this other stuff behind it. And so I kind of had hid the curtain a little bit on that.
Yeah,
And therefore
exactly.
there's this feeling of like, well, was that all of it?
Yeah,
Is there full honesty around that?
definitely. It was really interesting in coming into this topic. I do my thing, and I was looking behind the scenes as to, you know, does my definition of vulnerability align with others,
Mm,
just refreshing memory, et cetera, et cetera. And I read this business case where there was a tech company, and they weren't doing great. So they were in B series funding. They had lost it all. And so the female CEO at the time had said, hey, I have to let you all go. Our B funding fell through. We've lost it. And leading up to this, the background context is this individual is quite vulnerable. She treated these people like her family. She would call them if their children were sick. She would identify if there's something going on in her family. It wasn't just employee 527 has 6 absences and we're going to check in on them then. She really treated people like individuals. And what I found quite interesting about that situation is that they actually volunteered to take half their salaries. And in turn, that company turned itself around and sold it for like, I can't remember, I think it was like 14 million. So it's absolutely amazing from a leadership perspective, what can happen within your workforce if you are vulnerable.
No, that's an awesome story, Angela, of the power of vulnerability in the workplace and how it can actually work to your advantage in terms of, and not coming from a place of being malicious. I think it worked to the advantage of everybody on the team.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
that they didn't actually lose their jobs, but yeah, they took half a salary, but then the company managed to turn around and hire them back full time. I mean,
Yeah,
this definitely comes full circle.
definitely. Yeah. And I think too, like when it comes to vulnerability, it reaps, I should say, trust.
Mhm.
Right? Because and you and I can attest to it.
Yeah.
Like coming into this conversation, we just had a very vulnerable
I didn't know who was
conversation.
going to bring it up first.
Who's going to the punchline this time, Scott? You know, when we expose our thoughts and our feelings about something, and it doesn't always have to get to feelings, maybe it's our thoughts and our opinions,
Mhm.
then that person knows that there's consistency, right?
Mhm.
Or understanding the fact that, you know, if there's something bothering Scott or if there's something bothering Ange, that it's a safe space to talk about it.
Mhm. I think it brings up something interesting, and I think both of us are good examples of it in terms of different personality types.
Mm,
And I know we lean a lot on disc, so we say, "Hey, I'm more conscientious. I know you're higher on the influence side of things." Ange tends to feel more comfortable being direct and sharing what's going on maybe in her life. I don't know if I'm describing this properly.
yeah,
Scott
yeah,
feels a little
the
bit more
DI side,
reserved,
for sure.
reserved in feeling those things. And so, like in the workplace, how do you, let's say as a manager, how do you support somebody that maybe is a little bit more reserved? And then how do you support somebody that isn't? And I guess it's kind of finding those, it's the adaptability
Mm,
piece, I guess. It comes back to like, as a
yeah,
manager,
for sure.
how do you adapt, recognizing that people show up around this topic vulnerability a little differently,
Mm,
and pushing the comfort zone of somebody else might be completely outside the comfort zone of the other person.
yeah, I
Very
like where you're going with
line.
that. I would come out to 60,000 feet, Scott, from a leadership perspective and say, you know, in the first instance, it's setting the example of what vulnerability looks like for your department or your organization or your company. And then in the second instance, it would be then to understand the motivators of your team members and their behaviors, like you're pointing
Mhm.
to, right? In the third step, then it would be also, I guess, streamlining your own expectations as a leader, as to what vulnerability looks like for other people. So you have your baseline within your organization of what vulnerability looks like, but also being able to ebb and flow with your team members as they learn how to be vulnerable.
Mhm.
One large thing that we've seen with clients in past is when the company is very vulnerable, when they're authentic, when they're people centric and they hire new team members, they have to help them unlearn a lot of things that they've learned in other organizations so that they
Mhm.
can be vulnerable, from a place of
Mhm.
courage
Yeah.
and show up in that people-centric manner.
It's like when I'm asking you, like, how's your day? If you're having a tough day, just tell me you're having a tough day. Like, that's okay. You don't have to tell me I'm fine or I'm good with that, the habit of just responding.
Right.
But, kind of building up that trust, I think, you're mentioning, and that unlearning when bringing in new employees, that no, we expect to hear from you. We
Hmm.
expect to understand, and we don't need to know the why behind everything. But I do, we do want to know how things are going, how you're feeling, so that we can better support you. Because it benefits everybody.
Definitely.
I know it's hard. It can be hard.
Yeah. It's not easy. It's not easy.
No.
And that's what I find so funny is like we call soft skills soft. There's nothing soft
Mm,
about soft skills.
nope.
Um, Communication can be tough, vulnerability can be
Hmm.
tough, curiosity can be tough, all of it can be challenging. So I think it's flipping the switch more so now than ever around vulnerability being a strength versus
Mhm,
it being a weakness, right? Because I think there's still some sort of stigma out there that,
mhm,
if I admit that I failed at something, or if I admit that I messed
mhm,
up, well, you're weak or you're a failure
mhm,
or whatever, insert negative or toxic thought, right?
mhm. Yeah.
Mm.
So what's the how piece around this? Let's say I have an organization. I'd like to implement more of this thing called vulnerability with my
Mm.
team. How are we building this out? How are we getting that 60,000 view of vulnerability before diving deeper into the behaviors and everything else?
Yeah, that's fair. That's a really fair question. I think for every organization, it's going to show up a little bit differently because we're all
Mm,
different.
yeah.
I think at the end of the day, as a leader, it's asking yourself, how can I exhibit vulnerability to my team
Mhm,
members first?
mhm,
I don't think it's fair to ask our teams to be vulnerable and us run as an organization that we're just setting a pace. I genuinely
mhm,
feel strongly about leadership in that we have to be able to show when we've messed up and what we're going to do
mhm,
to fix it. We have to be able to show when we're passionate about something, when we're excited about something. It's not just the negative situations. Vulnerability can be very positive
mhm,
too. Vulnerability can express contentment. It
mhm,
can express, a professional admiration. Within context, of course. So again, I think it comes down to how are we showing our walk with regards to our talk around vulnerability. For some people, again, that could be phone calls home to sick ones. It could be, if you're having challenges and someone's in the hospital and it's okay for you to jump in, then going into the hospital and sitting by their bedside. It could be, um, expressing gratitude,
mhm,
and understanding what your team members need from you to be vulnerable. And also understanding that it's not always going to come natural. So as a leader, being easy or kind to yourself in identifying, okay, how can I adapt my own style to vulnerability? And
mhm,
I think that's, coming full circle. That's why I'm saying it's different for every organization. Vulnerability, I think, also isn't something that is a one and done conversation. So there's different things or there's different traditions employers can have for vulnerability. What's on your walls? What's on your electric dashboards? What's talked about in your business meetings? How's it coming up by way of your agendas? What else can you do as a leader to really distill these things that matter to you within your organization?
mm. I think you touched on a lot of interesting points there, and I think one of them is that vulnerability isn't just negative things. It's not just bringing up the shitty feelings that are going on. It can be just as well as saying, "Hey, I'm really excited about this that we're working
Yeah,
on."
yeah.
Showing passion about what you're doing and being able to show up in that place. I think the other piece was, I think it's almost easy sometimes to show vulnerability when there's like a specific event, like a kid is sick or something happens. But it's just as important as like recognizing that if somebody's working on a hard project or a long project, and it's taking
Mm,
time to kind of to step up, let them know they're doing a good job, or that
hmm.
they're progressing forward, that the light is at the end of the tunnel, kind of thing. I think from that way.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then you'd also touch around like not trying to force vulnerability onto the team. And I was imagining when you were saying that almost like the team as a whole,
Mm,
but I was kind of looking at it, I guess, a little bit differently for the executive team alone,
okay.
and saying like, well, if the leadership can agree as to how we show up, because I think it might have different impacts if some leaders are vulnerable and others are leading with an iron fist within the
Oh,
company.
for
It kind of
sure.
creates this friction, right?
100%.
And so it's almost creating commitments as an executive team as to, well, how do we want to approach this? What does this look like? It's setting those expectations across
Very
the
much
board
so.
as to how are we going to show up first, even just for ourselves, but as an executive team, and then for our team members,
Mm,
recognizing that it does have a trickle down effect. That once the
mm-hmm,
leaders start acting one way, good or bad or different,
mm.
that will also have a trickle down effect to the rest of the team members as well.
Yeah, I really enjoy that how in the sense of, where do you start to distill vulnerability within the culture? Definitely starts with your executive team, 100%. And also being able to set things up as simple as, if you feel that a discussion's too excitable or too heated, regardless of which way it goes on the spectrum, to be able to be vulnerable and be like, all right, we need to take a step back and we're going to come back to this next Monday. You know, the how to, I think, Scott, what you're pointing to is really, really important in vulnerability, so that you can have consistency across your organization. I know in past we've had clients, and I've also worked for companies where there's some departments that are amazing and the turnover rate is super low. And then you know what it's like. There could be a couple pockets within the organization where it has a larger opportunity for growth. And you do see that there's higher levels of turnover or people that are dissatisfied or checking out. It's because of inconsistency of the leadership across the organization. So I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head there.
And I think too, when it comes to vulnerability, what it points to, and I'm stealing this from Brene Brown's thoughts, is it points to connection, right? So as humans, especially now going post-COVID and you know, living in this hybrid world, we crave connectivity. So it's asking yourself as a leader, how can I connect with my team through this thing called vulnerability? And again, I think everybody has slightly different definitions. What would you say, Scott, when it comes to it from your seat, informing this into a habit? How do you turn vulnerability into a habit?
For me, I would say it's identifying the triggers. What
Yeah,
is
yeah.
it that, what is that cue? What is the trigger that comes up in you when you notice something going on and you would actually benefit from being vulnerable around it? And so I know for me personally, it tends to be, okay, am I ruminating on something? Have I had a conversation with somebody talking about maybe social vulnerability here? Have I had a conversation with somebody that I didn't feel went as well as I was hoping for?
Right.
What am I thinking about that conversation? Is it running back in my mind? And if it is, one that has a huge negative impact on my productivity, it has a bad impact on my health because I'm, constantly thinking about this thing. And now it's saying, okay, well, that's a cue for me. Is that when I'm ruminating on thoughts or things that have gone on, and it doesn't just I can't just let it go. It means I need to address it. I need to address it in a way that might make me feel uncomfortable. And in the past, I wouldn't address it. I was good at pushing it down. I was going to say, nah, it's okay. It'll go away at some point. And sometimes it would take a couple of days. Other times it could be a week or two. But I've learned, and I'm starting to practice more and more that, trying to shorten that time frame to how long I let things settle, and actually bring them up and raising my hand and saying, hey, this thing happened, and we had this conversation. These are the thoughts that I've been having. Could we have a further discussion about it? And so I think that first piece you're asking about, how do you make this a habit? One is understanding, what are your cues? What are the things for you that you might benefit from adding a little bit more vulnerability into your life, or into more specifically into the workplace with the colleagues you work with?
Yeah.
Kind of that first step.
I'd like to add too, because you said something really important earlier, kind of piggybacking off each other here around excitement. So the positive pieces of vulnerability. So what was coming up for me was if you're really impressed with someone's work and it sat on your mind for a little bit, what are you going to do about it? Regardless of if they're in a different time zone, different continent, different province, where accessibility is there for us at our fingertips to be able to say, hey, Scott, great job on that pipeline. I think that's amazing that you reached out to XYZ because of ABC. I think those pieces are really important to us too, because that also builds the place of positivity and trust. So not just, are you going to be there for us when things are hard, but are you also going to be there for us when things are great? I think that's just as equally important when it comes to vulnerability.
What are your thoughts around the mode that's being transported? And I'm thinking about, we're in a hybrid environment, there's so many ways of communicating. How does the method of communication actually impact the way that you're showing up and how you're,
I think my short answer is it depends. So is it something that is email worthy? Contextually speaking, in my mind, in my preference, the most physical message that you can give is what you want to capitalize on. So if they're not within arm's reach, or they're not within a local office, then maybe it's some sort of, Zoom meeting or Teams meeting, etc., so that that person can see your nonverbal, even if it's just for 5 minutes, right? We don't have to commit to hour meetings to express gratitude from a place of vulnerability. It could be like, hey, Scott, can you jump on me for 5 minutes? I just have a quick data dump for you, or something like that, quick thing to chat about. So then you can see my excitement, you can see my expression, you can have that connectivity experience with me. If it's something that from a place of vulnerability is a little bit lighter, then, maybe it's just a quick DM, or, quick Slack or something like that. So yeah, coming back to it in short, I think it's contextually speaking, and then also understanding what your team members need. So, I know you, Scott, you would be perfectly fine with an email message of me saying, hey, great job on that. Versus, if you were to look at me and you gave me an option, the connectivity, that 5-minute Zoom meeting is what I would opt to, right? More often than not.
So what I'm hearing there again is understanding what your team's needs are, recognizing that some might actually want it to be, within a team meeting, that, hey, Ange, I'm giving you recognition in front of other people, and that kind of helps build things up. While other people in that same situation would like cower from that, and like despite them doing a really good job on something, would actually hate that and would much prefer that kind of one-on-one email, or kind of that one-on-one conversation.
And I think adding into that, if we're that's absolutely correct from a place of recognition. If we're looking at it from a place of vulnerability, I think there's some sort of factor in there where, there's courage around that place of vulnerability. Do you know what I mean? So it's identifying, what is it specifically that me as a leader needs to do a better job as to express excitement. I think that's the biggest takeaway, if we're strictly speaking to vulnerability. But you're absolutely right. From a recognition perspective, I would never want to be recognized in front of a huge group of people, even though I love connectivity. That's not me. I don't need that. But others do, and others crave it, and that's perfectly okay. And I think that piece on itself, from a cultural perspective in organization, is really important from a place of vulnerability. That I'm not going to judge Scott if he wants me to roll out the red carpet and celebrate his sales, and Scott's not going to judge Ange if she just wants, a quiet conversation of gratitude, or a conversation of vulnerability, etc.
Yeah. What's too far? Where's the line? How do we create? How do we define that vulnerability line? Because it can be a sticky one.
It can be, for sure. Vulnerability hangovers. I think that's an important topic to talk about too. Maybe for another time, but that's a hard one, Scott. Honestly, I think it's subjective in nature. So that judgment call, it has to do based on what type of reactions you have from your team members, from your peers, from the people socially in your life, as to your levels of vulnerability, and then being able to recalibrate those things, right? At the end of the day, understanding that we're all humans, and if we are trying to be vulnerable, that there's no judgment. If we have to take a take two on how much vulnerability we're kind of putting out there. I think that circles back to the first conversation, that personal vulnerability versus professional vulnerability. Like, how much do you let it hang out?
Yeah, no, that's fair. Yeah. So it sounds like having at least a certain degree of that personal vulnerability mixed in with a professional can be helpful in just getting to know your team members better, and like knowing that they have your back. Where that there's definitely a line there, I think, from a personal perspective.
Yeah. I think one really good example that I can share is, I had eye surgery a few months ago, and there was, a whole host of things going on. The rule happens in threes. I'm knocking on wood. And what had happened was the stitches failed and my eye opened back up. And I was literally like, it was just a week where I fucking wanted it to be over. Like, I was so done. And in my mind, though, we were going into a marketing meeting, and it was something to do with strategy, if I recall correctly.
Mhm.
And I was like, I'm waiting on the emergency callback. There's nothing I can do for myself right now. This is a good distraction. And when I showed up to the meeting, I was vulnerable. Literally, I was hanging out with no stitches in my eye, which it sounds horrible, but it really wasn't that bad in my mind. And, you know, as you were asking, how are you? I was vulnerable and I said, I'm pretty frustrated. There's a few things going on. But
Mhm.
the point of my story is that I said, and it's going to get better. I
Mm.
think that there's accountability that comes with vulnerability. And this is probably a totally different topic, but I think noteworthy is that
Mhm.
when we are vulnerable, part of that fine balance is our mindset behind our vulnerability. Because it's a totally different tone if I'm vulnerable and I just dump my crap on the table, right? Versus me saying, you know what, I'm having a hard go,
Mhm.
but surgery's going to give me a call back.
Yeah.
Saturday's a reset, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's a totally different vibe to it.
No, of course you're taking ownership or taking responsibility of the things that are coming up for you.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's not just saying, well, here you go, Scott, here's all my shit. Now what? It's like,
I'm
what
vulnerable.
am I supposed to do with it, right? I mean, I got
Yeah.
my own baggage. I got my own stuff I'm dealing with as it is. But I think you did touch on something that, like, we're going to talk about, like, well, what's a first step? Like, if I'm looking to be
Mm,
more or practice more professional vulnerability, I think you said it right there in the meeting. Just when you're starting a meeting, if somebody does ask how things are going or what's going on, and even if nobody asks, just raising your hand, just letting people know, hey
yeah,
guys, I actually, I didn't get a lot of sleep last night. I apologize if I'm coming off cranky. Like,
yeah,
that could be like the simplest, like, smallest step forward can actually have a
100%.
really big impact. And it changes things completely because the people in that team or that meeting now know how you're showing up. If they
Mm,
didn't know that and you did act all cranky in the meeting, they'd be like, hey, what's going on with this person? Like, why are they
yeah,
so mean today? Their thoughts would be completely different, and it can impact the relationship completely differently. But just having that small step of saying, hey, this is what's going on for me can, yeah, it can have a really
yeah.
powerful.
And I like where you're going with that, because in being vulnerable, even in in the shortest example or the shortest sense, that you're describing what connectivity feels like.
Mhm.
So understanding why that person's cranky or what's making them cranky, and understanding that it's something that's short term and not personal.
Yeah.
That's a connectivity piece. I can relate to you. I can
Mhm.
relate, if your dog was throwing up all night. I can relate to you as a human being versus left to my own demise to fill in the blanks,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, Ange, we got to wrap this up.
Okay. Another great
Eh,
topic, vulnerability.
yeah, there we go. All right, sounds good. We look
Take
forward to
care.
seeing you next time.
Yes, exactly. Take care, everyone.